Thank you for that awesome introduction. I'm really, really grateful to be here tonight. Stephen Jones, the director of the research station, and I have known one another since this Food Justice Conference in 2011, and I've been tremendously inspired by his work and by the work all of you affiliated with the research station are doing. I'm a huge admirer of the diverse agricultural communities of the Pacific Northwest, having spent some time on the faculty at the University of Oregon. And so it's my particular joy to be here, to have journeyed from Los Angeles, another small town on this side of the country, to participate in the Harvest Seminar, and also just to see firsthand the work that's happening here in the fields and the greenhouses and the bread lab. I think the work that you all are doing here at the research station in particular is a really inspiring model of what's possible in terms of changing paradigms around agriculture, even while we work within what has proven to be effective. In other words, not reinventing wheels that don't need reinventing. So thanks for having me and for being here this evening. I'm really excited by the turnout. I hope this will be a really lively exploration of crossing boundaries between science and the humanities, between agriculture and digital technology, and between imagination and infrastructure. So whether this all holds together remains to be seen. Slow food in digital times. So what I'm sharing with you this evening is new research that's part of a book-length project I'm calling Food Culture in Digital Times. In the final chapter of the book that Brooke mentioned, Global Appetites, I look at what became a really popular genre of nonfiction in the 2000s that I call the Locavore Memoir. These are some of the most best-selling examples of the Locavore Memoir. Some of you may recognize, in particular, Omnivore's Dilemma and Animal-Vegetable Miracle, both of which found their way to the New York Times bestseller list, top 10 list. You may be less familiar with Gary Paul Nabhan's 2002 Coming Home to Eat and Novella Carpenter's Farm City. I'm going to talk a little bit about the latter of those. In any case, the Locavore Memoir documents typically a year-long experiment in growing, procuring, and foraging for food within a certain number of miles from the author's home, typically 100, that magic number that Bay Area locavores suggested should be a global standard, and that has been critiqued rightfully. To justify this self-imposed constraint, the writers tend to appeal to the political and ethical arguments of agrarian writers like Wendell Berry, who in his famous essay, The Pleasures of Eating, chastised the industrial eater as, quote, passive and uncritical, end quote. And he fired up his environmentally conscious readers to see, quote, eating as an agricultural act and to learn the origins of your food. This 1989 essay has been incredibly influential of everything from farmers markets to CSAs to farm-to-table cuisine, and its legacy sort of beats on in the work especially of these writers. So on the one hand, these writers do indeed follow Berry in drawing pretty sharp moral lines between good and bad ways of consuming food and between good and bad eaters. But on the other hand, they really dwell even more than Berry on the pleasures of this good way of eating. And it's interesting to note that Coming Home to Eat by Gary Paul Nabhan, who lives in the southwest of the United States and is an ethnobotanist by training, the subtitle is The Pleasures and Politics of Local Foods, and his decision to lead with pleasure, I think, is important here. These writers tend to revel in some of the ideas that the slow food movement has popularized internationally of conviviality, gathering around a table together, of artisanal and traditional cuisine and other forms of food preparation, and of heirloom seeds, above all. And those values really come together in this cover to a book not as well known as these others, The Pleasures of Slow Food, celebrating authentic traditions, flavors, and recipes. And its preface is written by the founder of Slow Food International, the Italian bon vivant and activist Carlo Petrini. So these Locavore memoirs, and I would argue the international slow food movement that these writers have popularized here in the United States, convey typically a strong opposition not only to industrialized agriculture and to fast food, but also to some of the underlying cultural values of speed that drive life in the digital age, and that also drive the infrastructure of information networks. I mean, speed has been the central concept that has organized a lot of the innovation coming out of places like Silicon Valley, that we must move and work and think and communicate faster. But I hypothesize that these locavore diets and the kind of wider slow food movement actually is more bound up with information technologies and information networks than we might think at first glance. So despite on the surface the critique not only of biotechnologies, I'll talk more about that, but also information technology, these writers depend a great deal on being able to disseminate information, their sort of message, disseminate it via digital media, and also accessing forms of knowledge that they get through virtual communities, not just local communities. Particularly in urban contexts, the sort of amateur locavores and greenhorns often are plugging into these networks of farmers and gardeners and chefs and cheesemakers and brewers and fermenters and foragers and so on in order to gain knowledge and build new know-how that's been lost or that they haven't received firsthand. And at the same time, some of their commitments to something like farm-to-table cuisine or urban agriculture are often at odds with members of their own local community who shop and procure food and prepare food with values other than food miles in mind. And so I think that bears sort of us thinking about that the sort of emphasis on the local in the locavore movement doesn't always acknowledge that there are other communities for whom the local isn't the most important value. And there are good reasons for that often. So I will be speaking about this momentarily, but I'll let you absorb it because there's a lot of data. If you remember the person I said you were least likely to know, Novella Carpenter, I call her a rabble-rouser among the locavores. She is Oakland-based, West Oakland, which is an inner-city, very multi-ethnic, extremely poor community. And she writes Farm City, an education of an urban farmer, in order to highlight some of the complexities about growing food and raising livestock in somewhere like West Oakland. Ultimately, she suggests that the goal of reducing food miles is an insufficient objective for the 21st century alternative food movements. It's not that she thinks it's an uncompelling motivation, but it's not enough. We need more than that to sort of build the future of the food system on. And she, at one point, attempts a 100-yard diet for 1 month. And this month is a caffeine-deprived, headache-filled, miserable month in which she's begging and pleading from neighbors, wondering if she's breaking her rules if she begs and pleads chocolate from them, as long as they're within the 100 yards. And orders desperately via FedEx green tea plants from China at the end of this 100-yard diet. So I love this because I think she is really putting some pressure on the romanticization of some one distance that would define a sustainable food system. So she comes to realize that a truly sustainable, robust food system, but also food culture, is one defined both by a certain amount of local self-sufficiency, but also exchange with other places and other communities. So her book, I think, is ultimately less about the locavore diet than about rebuilding the kinds of connections and exchanges of knowledge that would make that possible. And knowledge about everything from cultivating grains and raising livestock to putting up vegetables and curing meat. And for her, she's really a case in point for my research. The attainment of that know-how relies on person-to-person exchange with people in her immediate milieu and these virtual communities. This online, for example, online hatchery catalog where she gets her various and sundry livestock that she begins to grow and raise in West Oakland, including pigs. I mean, the ducks and chicken are one thing for her neighbors, but when the pigs arrive, she has gotten herself into hot water. But there's also a kind of mix in her approach between really old-fashioned trial and error and a much more high-tech kind of information paradigm. Okay, so to here. These arguments about locavores and slow food are informing my research into the wider sort of politics and practices around seeds in the digital age. And there are, on the surface, really profound conflicts between seed patenting and seed saving today. And I'm sure there are many folks in this room who have a lot of thoughts about that conflict, about which we can get into. So I'm going to try to be Switzerland in this talk. So I think these conflicts, though, have an echo in the digital world that is instructive. An echo in the conflict between the intellectual property paradigm that brought us software licensing and something like this, and the open source framework. Nor are these simply analogies in my view. There are very material ways these two apparently separate worlds are cross-pollinating. So to flesh out this idea, I want to turn to the topic of genetically modified seeds, the non-controversial topic of genetically modified seeds. So every year, an Iowa-based consulting firm that works for Big Ag named Context publishes a report on the global proprietary seed market, which in the 2011 report it valued at $37 billion. In touting the rapid growth in this market, Context also highlights the decline of farmer-saved seed and also the decline of non-patented seeds, which of course there's overlap here, over the past several decades. The report further suggests that proprietary has become nearly synonymous with transgenic. For instance, the USDA around the same time released the statistic that nearly 90% of all corn planted in the US was transgenic. And this gives you a sense of sort of adoption rates of various transgenic or GM crops, soy, cotton, both HT and BT cotton, and both HT and BT corn. Since '97, when the first genetically modified seeds hit the market through 2012. So back to the locavores. In the public sphere, genetically engineered and genetically modified rather than proprietary and patented are the words that have really galvanized slow food and other social movements to protest. As with locavore writers specifically, this wider anti-GMO opposition has gained a lot of traction via a moral argument, which goes something like this. Transgenic science is wrong a priori for playing God in the garden. So end of conversation. There's nothing to explore because we just shouldn't cross the species boundary. And this 1998 op-ed by Michael Pollan sort of cemented, if you will, that argument. And it hasn't moved that far afield in the main. In this room, I imagine there's far more nuanced and complex sort of ways of thinking about this. So this has been politically salient. It's been really powerful and effective, and I certainly appreciate why, and it's not without appeal even to me. But the argument risks ignoring crucial differences between environmental and human health consequences of GMOs, and also between legal, economic, and cultural implications of seed patenting, whether or not we're talking about transgenics. And so why do these distinctions matter? One answer is this: the catch-all critique of GMOs that Pollan has made so famous has foreclosed on a much-needed analysis of how to evaluate and how to regulate different kinds of GMOs, and who should be doing the science, and with what kind of public input. And also, it has sort of foreclosed on a discussion about the long history of genetic modification, but also the long history of non-patented seeds. And these are in kind of lockstep. Finally, the scientific differences among transgenic, hybrid, and open pollinated seeds get completely lost in the shuffle. So both the kind of GMO boosters like Context and anti-GMO activists depict the privatization of seeds as a categorical break from what came before. Yet, in fact, the private seed industry, as a lot of you know, in the US dates back to at least the 1930s, when hundreds of companies formed to act as brokers between farmers and the land-grant universities and agriculture research stations that developed most new seed varieties at the time. And then with the 1970 Plant Variety Action Act, there we go, Plant Variety Protection Act, this trend redoubled as novel seeds became eligible for intellectual property protection. So the 21st century proprietary seed market is an extension of, rather than a radical break from earlier developments along these lines. What is novel, though, I would hazard, is the story we're telling about propagation and cultivation, a story in which seeds increasingly are technologies. And here the point I'd like to try to make tonight is we're thinking about them not just as biotechnologies, that's more evident and easier to grasp, and it's more literal, but we're thinking about them also as information technologies. But this is not the story that the locavores advance. They advance two other stories, and they're very stark. According to the one story, food sustainability depends on restoring the past. And that past is typically a very romantic one. We'll leave it at that. And on the other side is a future in which one company, who will go unnamed tonight, I have no lawyers and they have a lot. One company is controlling the entire world food supply. There are these two possibilities. And what I want to suggest is, first of all, this kind of stark binary storyline gives far too much rhetorical ground and political capital to that one company. And second, it fails to notice that rather than just these two stories before us, we actually have right now this incredible diversity of stories being told about both the past and the future of food. And those diverse stories are mirrored by the incredible diversity of practices that also do not neatly align with either big ag over here and very small organic agriculture over here. And those sort of plurality of stories range from informal seed libraries in my parents' town of Basalt, Colorado, to open access seed lines developed at research stations like this one. So rather than a binary of this company's world and its united opposition, I would invite us to build a kind of library of stories that, much like a seed collection, would provide both knowledge of historical practices and a range of possibilities for the future. To me, that's a kind of definition of sustainability that is both kind of ecological and cultural in nature. So, in building this, in trying to build this library, my new research is looking at the range of stories that have taken shape then around these institutionalized seed banks, like the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway, which I'll talk about, and more small-scale networks of seed development, exchange, and saving in the decades since the 1970, thank you, Plant Variety Protection Act. And I should say by story here, I don't just mean I'm an English professor. And so you may be thinking I mean poems, plays, and novels. But I actually don't just mean conventional literary genres of storytelling. I also mean the inherent capacities of storytelling that are in other kinds of objects and other kinds of practices. So the kinds of narrative capacities that are in images and in maps and in models and in engineering specs, as I'll talk about tonight, and also the stories that implicitly underlie scientific methodologies and everyday practices of farmers and food purveyors. All of this, there's story there. And so it's about trying to articulate what those stories are and put them into a kind of dynamic conversation. That's what I'm interested in doing, to get us out of this kind of rut of these stark oppositions. So I just give you an example here of three things that are not poems, plays, or novels that I treat as stories. Fallen Fruit on the left is an artist collective in Los Angeles that sadly, like all great rock and roll bands, just split up. I'm very disappointed to find out. They're not a famous rock and roll band, but they seem to be following that path anyways. So what they have done is created hundreds of these hand-drawn maps of neighborhoods around the world. They began in Los Angeles, but they've expanded out. Copenhagen, Mexico City, Portland, rural Norway. And they are creating maps of what they call public fruit. And as those of you that were here for the lunch talk heard, what they mean by public fruit is fruit that's in the public domain, whether it's simply a single branch hanging over into the public domain whose tree is rooted in private property, or an entire tree. And they have these incredible, colorful legends. And Part of why they've opted not to use GIS, or what's known as geotagging, they're not working off of Google Maps, they're hand drawing these maps, is they want them to be partial. They want the user of the map to actually have to experience and learn about their own neighborhood in a new way by having sort of approximate rather than precise orientation to the public fruit. So this is one of Sherman Oaks in Los Angeles. And the maps they did in LA were particularly important because, as some of you may know, LA County used to be a major area of fruit production along with its southern neighbor, Orange County. And most of that large-scale orchard production disappeared with development. So this is also about memory, about sort of remembering a past and trying to see the way it still is in the present. So these fruit tree maps are, to me, very rich in story. Another thing I would point you to, which is about treating practices as stories, is the work of native seed search in the Southwest United States, which Gary Paul Nabhan was a co-founder of. This is a seed saving. They do seed development and seed saving and seed storage, and they do a lot of training and workshops, and they share seeds. But when you go to their website or when you visit their facility, what they do is they tell stories about how certain seeds are about one family's journey to the United States. So that's what that seed represents to them, or about an entire ethnic community's culinary traditions, a particular seed. And we could sort of go on and on about that, but these practices of saving seeds are also about saving stories and creating new ones by actually putting seeds into new contexts, cultural contexts, and also environmental contexts. And even this incredibly dry, on first glance, graph of the ERS service that shows the adoption of genetically engineered corn, its selection of color, its headline, and even the sort of decision to foreground BT in this story, in the graph, is a story to me. So I'm just trying to give you a kind of sense of the way I want to think about storytelling around food culture, and particularly seeds. And then I'm going to be coming back to the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, but even in something like this, these engineering specs, we are getting a whole story about why we must have a kind of backup of the world's agricultural biodiversity, which Svalbard Seed Vault represents. And so I won't dwell on this now because I'm returning to it towards the end of the talk. So in some initial primary research with this idea that story is happening all around us, I've worked with a team of students to identify and digitally archive over 100 artifacts related to seed banks and more small scale and less well-documented seed saving practices around the United States. And so these 100 artifacts include everything from a lot of footage of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault to an NPR story about this seed library I mentioned in Basalt, Colorado. They include virtual seed catalogs in video games. You can add various kinds of agricultural modules, not just to the video games we may be aware of that are all about agriculture, like Farmville, but also to video games that have nothing ostensibly to do with food production. So this is one of my students got very interested in seed saving and seed propagation modules that you can buy and add into your video game. So this is outside my own territory of expertise, but I found it fascinating. This was not just a one-off example. And then finally, another thing that turns out to be all the rage are seed bomb wedding favors. And so they found a whole host of Pinterest and Etsy sites where you learned how to make a seed bomb wedding favor. And to me, this is a particularly interesting example of the complexity of stories around food. The seed bomb originated as a very radical activist technology for intervening in the urban environments where there was a vacant lot that had been left to just be vacant, and the seed bomb was meant to propagate, right, a communal edible food source, edible landscape. And so to see this morph from guerrilla farming to wedding favor, right, it shows how how prone our stories about food are to adaptation and mutation. And that, but there is something even to the kind of most conventional bride where the seed speaks to her. So I thought this was kind of fascinating. And these are my student researchers. They've been incredible. The aim of this line of the research then is twofold: to archive what would otherwise be really ephemeral, fleeting stories about seed propagation, seed cultivation, seed collecting, and seed exchange practices that are happening around us. And to understand how different communities, including scientific communities, are thinking about the ecological as compared to the technological dimensions of the seed and of food production writ large. So the writers and artists and scientists and farmers and gardeners and activists and wedding planners we've encountered thus far, they reimagine and they adapt rather than reject out-of-hand technology. And they do so by embracing the inherent technological character of agriculture, while also thinking about technology not as necessarily proprietary, not necessarily as a commodity to be planted, commercialized, licensed, and sold, but as a creative resource. And this actually takes the word technology back to its ancient roots in Greek, where it meant the art, craft, technique, method, or skill of making something. And I find that ancient definition really instructive here. But there's also the Latin root, which simply means know-how or applied science. And so that's something else I hold in mind here, that technology is not just that which gets commercialized and sold. We are not just consumers of technology, we are makers as well. So to elaborate on this claim then, I have two final illustrations this evening. The first is something an English professor is prone to talking about, a novel. So in The Consequences of Modernity, sociologist Anthony Giddens, this is a sort of famous book about globalization and about our own times and what most defines them. He defines post-industrial societies like the United States as those in which both political power and material profit go to the institutions, firms, and people who manage information. And I would argue, as a kind of subset of that theory, that a post-industrial food system is one in which power and profit goes to those who design, own, license, and analyze complex information systems, from technology use agreements that are attached to hybrid or transgenic seeds, to GPS data that's sold in packages for monitoring water, soil, and weather. So enter into this mix Japanese-American novelist Ruth Ozeki and filmmaker, she's also a filmmaker, whose novel All Over Creation explores how seeds and data connect to one another in a post-industrial context, or in what we might just call in the information age. So there's her character, Will Quinn. He's an Idaho potato farmer who, having purchased a GPS software package, spends more time, quote, at the computer, sweating at it, trying to input data and generate readouts and maps, end quote, as farming his 3,000 acres. Increasingly beholden to IT experts and big data, Will's own expertise and multi-generational know-how seems to fall by the wayside. Months after investing in these new technologies of what some have called precision farming, we learn that he is still trying to master the basics and not getting very far in that effort. So it's easy to imagine that this novel, written by a novelist who's been a very public advocate for locavore and slow food movements, does indeed divide the world neatly up into the sort of big agriculture, which is industrialized and technology-driven, and its opposite. But in fact, the novel positions technology at the center of not just the large-scale computer-managed farm, but also small-scale cultivation and bootstrapped food activism. So it's structured around several plots, and one centers on the character Yumi Fuller's return from Hawaii to Idaho after a 20-year absence to care for her aging parents, while one of the other plots focuses on a very unconventional coalition that forms between Yumi's Christian conservative parents, Lloyd and Momoko, and a motley band of anti-GMO activists led by this guy named Geek, who call themselves the Seeds of Resistance. So threaded through the novel is the word information. It appears more than 30 times, almost always attached to seeds. In the novel, characters repeatedly explain the propagation and dissemination of seeds through analogies to information technologies that range from books and libraries to software programs and computer chips. And the significance of all this really comes to light in a long description of open pollinated seeds that Ozeki crafts. And I'll just read this. Every seed has a story, Geek says, encrypted in a narrative line that stretches back for thousands of years. Seeds tell the stories of migrations and drifts. So if you learn to read them, they are very much like books, with one big difference. What's that? Yumi's 6-year-old daughter Ocean interjects, and we realize we are listening in on a bedtime story. Yumi continues, the difference is this. Book information is relevant only to human beings. It's expendable, really. As someone who has to teach for a living, English, by the way, I shouldn't be saying this, but the planet can do quite well without books. However, the information contained in a seed is a different story, entirely vital. So in this description, the novel asks us to think about seeds not just as biological, not just as germ of what we eat and hence ingest and digest, but also as a kind of medium for storing and circulating information, and a particular kind of information, story. As living books, seeds carry information at the genetic and cellular scales that also have implications for ecological and social histories, not to mention futures. As living books, they carry information that can be shared within a local community, but also across huge expanses of space and time. As living books, they're written and rewritten through trial and error, and also through sharing and saving and sharing and using them. And so with this powerful metaphor of the living book, Ozeki draws our attention to seeds as a technology for knowledge transfer, from person to person, place to place, and also past to future. In the story, Momoko and Lloyd propagate heirloom seeds on a tiny plot adjacent to their own large potato farm. And those seeds wind up in, quote, envelopes for dissemination by the US Postal Service to destinations around the world, end quote. So this slow food project within the novel, it relies, we learn at the outset, on this post-industrial system of global communication and distribution. And then to add to that, Geek is really afraid that the seeds will die out with the Fullers, who are aged and aging rapidly. Lloyd Fuller has terminal cancer, and Momoko has dementia. So he gets sort of fired up to actually transform what he calls their ancient dusty library into an ordered system with a comprehensive online catalog. So he wants this seed catalog to be sort of digitized, if you will. He says at one point, talk about narrative in describing this digitization project. And here he reinforces this idea that seeds are media of storytelling, but also that their dissemination is a kind of communication technology. So evident in all these different visions of seeds that are whirling around this best-selling novel, we see that Ozeki imagines that it's not just agribusiness versus small-scale agriculture, that actually technology is somehow sort of central to our food system, to how we sort of connect to the edible world and produce an edible landscape. And that in doing so, though, what she wants us to really think about is that technology and story are also not diametrically opposed. So at one point, Geek tells a new Seeds of Resistance recruit, Frank, that their movement is a network of cells, and their goal is to keep information and energy flowing like a seed bomb. So I think in the end, the reason I'm drawn to this particular novel as a scholar is that it's really inviting me, at least, to question the aspiration of many locavore writers and slow food convivia to realign agriculture with nature. It does so by challenging the notion that biological phenomena and organisms are somehow less complex than synthetic ones. The melding of biology and technology that Ozeki imagines by suggesting that it's through story that we can even conceptualize that complex melding, reveals a defining feature, I think, of food in our information age, which is that organic bodies are conceptualized as information, but also that they actually do circulate within information networks, virtual and real. So let me then shift gears for the sort of final part of my talk. I was asked to speak for about an hour, but I don't plan to speak for quite an hour, more like 50 minutes. and turn from this work of fiction about seed saving and seed dissemination to a very real-world infrastructure for seed storage that I mentioned a bit ago, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway. This is the outcome of a pretty tremendous international collaboration, and here are some of the major entities, NGOs and national entities, the Kingdom of Norway, for example, that have been involved. It's a project that responds to the potential for catastrophe, to wipe out national and regional seed banks. And alongside, though, this note of urgency and alarm, the vault has been promoted in really positive terms as a humanitarian Noah's Ark of the biological diversity that seeds, that the seed bank tries to capture and protect. So the infrastructure distinguishes it from small-scale informal seed exchange communities, and it does so also by offering us a vision about the present and the future of the world food supply, where there's this kind of sense that consolidation and centralization are necessary, necessary to the security and sustainability of the food supply. And here I would argue that unlike the way Ruth Ozaki's characters think about seeds as information technologies, here there's a much more direct connection to some of the major players in our digital world, namely Google and other providers of the so-called cloud. Just as those cloud computer providers call on us to back up our data, so too do the entities involved with the Global Seed Vault call on us to back up our seeds. And you can also look to the engineering specs, how they're described for this connection to server farms and data centers. Svalbard has the capacity to store 4.5 million seed samples and 2.25 billion seeds, and, quote, offers backup storage for the 1,400 gene banks around the world. And this phrase, backup storage, occurs over and over again in the way the engineers and the investors in Svalbard talk about its goals. So it highlights, too, of course, the scale of the vault, and it also suggests that there's a connection between what has been called big data and the sort of world food supply that's being backed up at Svalbard. So I just want to turn then from the Svalbard schematics to the server farm. So recent media coverage of Google data centers supports this observation that the biological inputs into the food system are being thought of as like so much data to be secured, backed up, and hosted by global firms and institutions. In a recent article in Wired magazine, technology journalist Stephen Levy described a Google data center he visited. This was a somewhat unprecedented visit on the part of a journalist. All of the major server farm operators, from Google to Facebook to Apple to Dell, Amazon, have kept their facilities private and under sort of cloak of secrecy, claiming that the sort of technology in particular for keeping server rooms cool is very proprietary and a competitive advantage for them. So this was really significant that these photographs of the interior of Google data centers hit the pages of Wired magazine, the main technology magazine in the country. So Levy, the journalist, described being inside the data center like this. What strikes you immediately is the scale of things. The room is so huge, you can almost see the curvature of Earth in the end. And it's wall to wall, racks and racks and racks of servers with blinking blue lights, and each one is many, many times more powerful and with more capacity than my laptop. And you're in the throbbing heart of the internet. So his image reminds us how many ecological and even agricultural images we use to explain the infrastructure of the information systems and data networks that we access all the time. So we have mountains of data and streaming content. We have server farms and the hive mind. And within this array of ecological and agricultural metaphors, the most ubiquitous is the cloud. So ubiquitous, we forget it's a metaphor. It's very interesting. The first meaning in English of the word cloud was rock, which is long obsolete. But I find it really interesting in this context. I'm simultaneously doing research on the environmental footprint of cloud computing to remind ourselves that the cloud first meant this incredibly physical of the earth material. So anyways, Levy's article on Google server farms in places like the Dalles and North Carolina disturbs this ecological sense of a light and airy green fairyland where our data lives. By taking readers into the throbbing heart of the internet. And there he encounters what he describes as these walls of concrete warehouses, endless racks of servers, a morass of electrical circuitry, and water-hungry cooling systems, all of which, he says, makes the ephemeral real. And what I have been sort of exploring and thinking about is how similar the infrastructure for Svalbard is. And so I'm going to let you just sort of take in those images as I continue here. So Levy's images of the server farm, which attempt to make it real to us, also prove really fitting to describing this large-scale infrastructure for storing and cataloging seeds. Viewed side by side, the structure of the seed vault and the server farm, or data center more precisely, point to a shared way of seeing our world today, according to which both organisms and data need to be consolidated, centralized, and securitized. Put differently, if we are sowing data, literally building rows of server farmers on more often than not former farmland, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault suggests that we are also digitizing seeds by treating them like so much data. So to circle back to all over creation, where am I? What am I doing? It's a question I'll ask myself for some time now. So to circle back to all over creation, I think that Ozeki is powerful here because she aligns the cultivation and exchange of seeds not with non-technology, but with a particular kind of technology that's not consolidated, centralized, and securitized, that is open and communal and ongoing. In other words, the metaphors she crafts to help readers understand seed saving and seed propagation are metaphors about community at the same time that they are metaphors about technology. And that goes back to my point that the roots of technology are about making, about doing things that actually make life work a little better. And so there's an implicit kind of communal dimension to our impulse as a species to create technologies. And in fact, a lot of Ozeki's way of thinking about these complex connections between agriculture and technology and between communal forms of agricultural knowledge and open source forms of technology in the digital world, a lot of that harkens back to a moment in the history of the internet, in the early days of Silicon Valley, which, as internet historian Fred Turner has shown so brilliantly, was a place of counterculture at one point, where the Back to the Land movement in Northern California informed utopian ideas about computers and a digital commons. So in the final analysis, All Over Creation crafts analogies between seed networks and digital networks to tell a story about the value of the communal and the amateur forms of know-how and knowledge transfer. In contrast, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault and its infrastructure and its rhetoric lines up with the data centers of IT companies like Google. In this sense, Svalbard upholds post-industrial values of technical expertise and information management, even though this subterranean facility has been touted as a global commons. So thank you.